This is a story of war, a man's life, and 3 guys' weekend road trip, an escapade which would end in disaster. The year was 1942. At this point in time, no attack had yet been carried out on the contiguous United States. However, the Japanese submarine I-25, and specifically one pilot, was about to change that fact forever. In order to properly investigate the story I'm telling today, a trip to the southern Oregon coastal town of Brookings was in order. My name is Keegan Van Hook. I'm a photographer, writer, and documentary filmmaker. This is Gabe Wooden, artist, anarchist, and my go-to creative consultant. And this is Kenny Karter, a biology student, my best friend, and an extremely reasonable person who in a single lapse of judgment decided to join the expedition for fun. He would later regret this choice. The final character I have to introduce to this road trip story is the bearer of burdens herself, my 1995 Subaru Impreza, affectionately named Blue by a good friend of mine. Up until the day before our departure to Brookings, Blue was a bit of a run-down-looking car. She was missing detailing, had chipping clear coat, and overall lacked any sense of style or personalization. The fanciest thing about her were the tires, which I had just gotten brand new about a week or so before Gabe and I gave her a much-needed makeover. First, we removed all the black trim from the car's exterior. I had been long struggling, without success, to fix the trim on the passenger side door, but after a while decided it would be easier to remove it all and start over with a cheaper and ironically easier to use material. We replaced it with black Gorilla Glue duct tape. Next, we attacked Blue's lack of style by using the same tape to give her a more sporty look with racing stripes. Blue was ready for action, now more than ever. To celebrate, Gabe and I took her out for a little joyride on the lovely country roads near Ashland, where we go to school.
The fuck is that?
Gabe needed to refresh himself on how to drive stick, in case something happened to me that required him to take over driving duties. We used this joyride as an opportunity to get him up to speed. It was Friday afternoon, and we were ready to leave for Brookings. We left Saturday at noon. Gabe was hungover. I was overconfident. Kenny brought his Nintendo Switch. It was going to be a wonderful trip. But what happened in Brookings that warranted our visitation? That takes us back to 1942, the Second World War, and the Empire of Japan. Nobuo Fujita was a warrant-flying officer of the Imperial Japanese Navy. He manned a Yokosuka E-14Y floatplane kept aboard the aircraft carrier submarine I-25 under the command of Lieutenant Commander Meiji Tagami. Fujita, his plane, and the sub were present at the attack on Pearl Harbor, as well as involved in reconnaissance prior to the invasion of the Aleutian Islands. Of course, it wasn't until September 9th of 1942 that history was made. Up until this point, the mainland United States had not suffered any form of attack from Axis powers. The Japanese wanted to change that with a series of small sneak attacks on the Pacific Northwest. The plan was for pilot Nobuo Fujita to disembark from I-25 in his GLEN, drop incendiary bombs on the highly combustible late summer forests of southern Oregon, then retreat while the American military's resources were drawn away from the Pacific Theater to fight the Inferno. The later and more famous fire balloon missions were an attempt at much the same goal. Around 6 in the morning, the Japanese I-25 emerged from the Pacific Ocean just west of the Oregon-California border. Fujita and his co-pilot Okuda Shoji took off shortly after, making a beeline for the coast. The GLEN was spotted from the fire lookout on Mount Emily a little over 10 miles outside of Brookings by Howard Raz Gardner. Raz reported the sighting of the plane, and even though he didn't see the bombing itself, saw the smoke plume generated by the growing blaze. Nobuo Fujita had dropped 2 incendiaries on the Siskiyou National Forest, but seemingly only one of them had any effect. Raz was instructed to hike towards the bomb site on Wheeler Ridge to see what containment he could accomplish while awaiting additional support. Nature was on Oregon's side that day. Recent rains had kept the forest damp, limiting the effectiveness of the bombs. Swift response from the Forest Service stopped the flames before they could grow to any threatening size. All in all, the attack was pretty negligible. The flames were out, and Fujita and his plane were long gone, but not unnoticed. The GLEN was reported not only by Raz, but also lookouts at 2 other stations, who heard the engine of the float plane coming out of the fog. Not to mention, countless people in Brookings spotted the tiny seaplane as it flew over the town in both directions over the course of the attack. Eventually, I-25 was intercepted and attacked by USAF aircraft, forcing it to dive and hide on the ocean floor off the coast of Port Orford. 3 weeks later, they surfaced and launched a second offensive with the same plan. Fujita once again dropped 2 incendiary bombs and reported seeing flames, but the attack went completely unnoticed by the United States. I-25 shortly after torpedoed and sank the SS Camden and SS Dawney, then began its course for home. On the way, it mistook the Soviet sub L-16 for an American vessel and sank it as well, adding another kill to its repertoire. It's an interesting war story, but it doesn't quite explain why it took us all to Brookings, and why after a brief visit to the beach, we found ourselves in the Chetco Public Library. The answer is this ancient weapon of the samurai.
Shit's 400 years old.
3, 2, 1. Nobuo Fujita continued as a pilot for the Imperial Navy, doing mostly reconnaissance until 1944, when he was transferred to the training of kamikaze pilots. Eventually, the war ended, and he started civilian life by opening a hardware store in Ibaraki Prefecture. In 1962, as an act of friendship, Fujita was given a surprise invitation to pay a visit to Brookings, and accepted after the Japanese government was assured he would not be tried as a war criminal. With him, Fujita brought this sword, which had been a relic in his family for over 400 years. Burdened with guilt over his actions during the war, Fujita intended to use the sword to commit seppuku if he was met with hostility in Brookings. Despite his visit being controversial, he was given a warm welcome, and instead of killing himself with it, offered the sword as a donation to the town as a symbol of regret. Fujita would return to Brookings several more times over the course of his life, acting as an informal ambassador of friendship and peace. In 1985, he invited several students from Brookings to visit Japan, an act which earned him a letter from then-President Ronald Reagan, commending him for his generosity. In 1992, Fujita hiked to the bomb site on Wheeler Ridge and planted a tree as a gesture of peace. In 1995, Fujita moved the sword from Brookings City Hall to the Chetco Public Library, where it rests in its display case to this day. Nobuo Fujita's story ends just a few clicks from where the meat of our road trip story begins. In October of 1998, Fujita's daughter returned to the bomb site to bury a portion of the World War II pilot's ashes under the tree of peace he planted. Two decades later, we go tearing along the dirt roads of Mount Emily, following Google Maps to the coordinates of the Wheeler Ridge bomb site. Knowing the history, we just had to pay a visit to this legendary place, regardless of how remote it was. I was confident driving on new tires. We were also racing for daylight. We had about an hour of it left by the time we hit the real shit on Mount Emily. Of course, the thought that driving into the wilderness that close to dark might be dangerous crossed all of our minds. Kenny, and numerous times, questioned if it was really a good idea. It wasn't. We continued on, though, mostly at my insistence, because with every minute we got closer to the bomb site, it became even more tempting to push it. And push it, I did. We went forth, really with little incident, aside from a few major potholes and the near destruction of my cell phone while attempting to get a shot.
What do you know? Surprisingly not as broken as I thought it would be. OtterBox work.
But somewhere, we took a wrong turn. We didn't know it at the time, but started to suspect something was wrong as the road started to get more and more gnarly with every mile. Finally, only 2 actual miles from the bomb site, we came upon a deep mud puddle almost bigger than the car.
We've already taken kind of a beating with the Impreza, and so we're kind of thinking maybe, fuck this.
Finally, it was enough to get me to want to stop. At least, stop the car. We decided we should turn around and head back for town. Of course, I was nearly shaking with frustration and disappointment. We were so close.
Which drives me insane because it's literally only 2 miles this direction.
But for the moment, my attention would be drawn away from the mission to a much bigger problem. As I tried to switch from reverse to first gear, something in the transmission just stopped working. As I gave the engine gas and received absolutely no torque in return, I knew we were in hot shit. Kenny and Gabe knew it as well. Their reaction was nearly immediate. Appropriately, Gabe started calling me stupid in every way he knew, while Kenny finally reached the end of his fuse, burst out in anger, and cursed the entire ordeal as being a bad idea. I think it was actually the first time I've ever seen Kenny genuinely red with anger. I don't really know why I am the way I am. I like to think it's drive, but it's probably closer to a completely fucked sense of danger and priority. While Gabe was figuring out how we were going to get out of the woods, I started thinking, well, if we're stuck here anyway, I might as well try and walk the remaining distance. Understandably, neither Kenny or Gabe were into the idea at all. High on adrenaline, I told them that I was going one way or the other and set out towards the bomb site.
2 miles from the bomb site, Kenny and Gabe have decided to stay with the car. But seeing as how close I am, I might as well go to see it because my car's probably fucked. This is an adventure, for sure.
It didn't take long of me walking alone through the twilight woodland landscape for more rational thoughts to prevail. A 4-mile round-trip hike was simply not the thing to be doing in a situation like this one. Furthermore, it was starting to dawn on me just how fucked the situation I had landed us in was. Frankly, I was being a bit of a selfish asshole for still trying to pursue the mission. I turned back around and returned to the car, where I found Kenny and Gabe still working hard on getting us out of the woods. They'd both, for the most part, calmed down, and with me joining the effort, it wasn't actually that long before we had contact with a tow truck company, thanks to a good cell reception spot just up the road. We spent the next 3 hours back and forth calling the towing company, which agreed to rescue us, but not to pulling Blue out due to the darkness and particular sketchiness of the road we were on.
So, Keegan drove into a ditch, broke the front end of his car, fucked it up,
Transmission's out.
and now we're stuck on a mountain in the middle of Oregon, nowhere near civilization. It's about an hour-and-a-half drive to civilization, which is a 6-hour walk, and now we're waiting on a goddamn, not even a tow truck, we're waiting on a pickup truck to come pick us up, charge us $135 just to take us back to a town. Then we have to find a way to either go back to Ashland, or we have to spend the night somewhere and then try to find a ride for tomorrow morning.
Yup. And Kenny's playing his Nintendo Switch.
It was a good decision to bring it.
Yeah, you got I leaned on the
Jesus
horn.
Christ.
After our last communication with the towers, we agreed to try and start walking out the way we came in to shorten the distance between us and them. It took us maybe about 15 minutes to get everything of value out of Blue, but it was only about 30 full seconds after we started walking that headlights finally shone through the trees and a large pickup truck rolled onto the scene.
How's it going? The car's like right around that corner if you
Yeah.
guys want to look
We
at
actually
it.
just started walking.
If there's a turnaround, yeah, I'll turn around there.
There is, yeah.
Yeah, just follow us down, I guess.
With the help of the towers, we moved Blue to a slightly more optimal position on the side of the road. Then, climbing into the truck, we abandoned her. I don't consider myself to be a particularly materialistic person, but leaving my beautiful Subaru in that forest is maybe one of the most heartbreaking moments of my life. Her loss, to the day of this recording, weighs heavily on my soul.
Cheap and Wi-Fi, that's all I need.
Do you guys happen to have a Sherry's in Brookings?
No.
Damn. It took a little over an hour of driving with the towers before we arrived back in Brookings. It was just before 10 p.m. We were, as expected, dropped off at a bank so that we could pay the men the ridiculously high fee of $135. Once the cash changed hands, we were left on our own, just the three of us and a few belongings, in the town of Brookings. This whole while, Gabe had been trying to contact friends of ours who might have both the resources and the willingness to come and rescue us.
There's just no way.
A little after 10, as we took our seats at the only open business, a McDonald's, we still hadn't found a ride home. It was starting to look more and more like we were going to spend the night in Brookings.
I don't know. Okay, so here's our situation. We're staying in Brookings. Forever. We're staying in Brookings until tomorrow morning when one of our friends can come and pick us up.
It was just after we checked the first motel, finding it full, that Gabe got a reply from our friend Patrick Setti saying he would come and get us. He was actually one of the first people Gabe had contacted, but he declined. I would later find out that he changed his mind simply because the thought of us three being stuck in Brookings made him feel bad. It would take at least 2.5 hours for Patrick to arrive, so we did what we could to make the best of the situation. We shared cigarettes and conversation with some local bar owners, visited the beach, and even watched a movie.
I love you so fucking much! Oh, Patrick!
When Patrick arrived just after 1:15 a.m., we hailed him as a god. He is a god. Patrick Setti is a god. The 2.5-hour drive back to Ashland went without incident aside from some thick fog on Interstate 5. We dropped Kenny off at his dorm, then drove up to Gabe and I's apartment.
We made it home.
We thanked His Holiness P. Setti profusely, forgot to give him the $40 we owed him for gas, then went inside and plopped down on the couch.
I can't believe we made it.
There's a thing I sometimes say about adventures. They either end in death or back on the couch. This is the first time I've gone on an adventure and found myself facing the first option out of those two. For a few seconds there, when I heard the grinding coming out of Blue's transmission, I briefly debated the possibility of us all dying out in those woods, freezing to death or falling off a cliff, or getting torn apart by wild animals. So, when back home, sprawled out in my living room, I was truly thankful for the fact that once again, one of my irresponsible exploits had ended back on the couch. When I set out on this project, I had not anticipated that the latter half of this story would occur. Obviously, when one sets out to make a documentary following real events, one should be ready to roll with the punches in terms of how the story is eventually told. But there was really no way I could have predicted the creative problem which now lies in front of me. I've essentially told two stories here, slightly intertwined, but hard to actually relate to each other. One story is a story about war, regret, and peace, while another is a story about adventure, hubris, and disaster. Those are two sets of themes I can't find a clean way to connect to each other. So perhaps the best way to connect them is to point out the butterfly effect. Here I am, a college student who no longer owns a car. Why don't I own a car? You could say it's because I'm an irresponsible asshole with an overactive craving for adventure and little regard for my own financial situation. Or you could say it's because 75 years ago, a single float plane dropped a bomb in the woods near Brookings.